Ena mana, ena reo, ena hariwha, tēnā koutou, tēnã koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome one and all to the 6th Baxter Memorial Lecture. I'm Kevin Clements, I'm chair of the Baxter Memorial Trust. Just to let you know, we're making good forward momentum on the Baxter Memorial, so thanks to all of you here who've made some contributions to that. We just hope that the New Zealand Lottery Fund will come up with the remainder we need to build the memorial at Albany Street. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest lecturer. David Grant probably needs no introduction whatsoever to those of you who are historians. He is an historian's historian and a New Zealand historian who probably has done more than a lot of other academic historians to kind of really focus attention on New Zealand's history. He's published 13 books and 11 major reports, 3 of which are about pacifism and conscientious objection, and that's the reason he's here tonight. But he's also published books on the Seamen's Union, the New Zealand Stock Exchange, Norm Kirk, Ken Douglas, and a whole lot of other people. And so he's very much an historian who is interested in exploring, both biographies of people that have made a difference in New Zealand's history, and movements that have made a difference in New Zealand history. And it's on one of those movements that we've invited him to talk here tonight. That is the movement on the part of all of those who've taken the courage to resist war. And there are two major books which I draw your attention to if you want to buy them. One is called Out in the Cold, which was, I think, the very first book that really brought together a lot of the history of New Zealand's conscientious objectors. And then the one which is really related to Mark Briggs tonight is called Field Punishment Number 1. So without any further ado, I'd just like to welcome you to David Grant, and we're in for a treat, I'm sure. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's nice, tēnā koutou katoa. It's nice to be here, to see some people I do know and people I don't know in the audience. Very early in the morning of the 14th of July 1917, guards at Mount Cook Jail in Wellington woke inmate Mark Briggs, handcuffed him and took him outside where a posse of military policemen frog-marched him through the streets of Wellington down to the troop ship Waitemata, which was berthed in the harbour. He was forced up the gangplank, preparatory to be taken to France to try to make him fight. This was Mark Briggs' adventure. It's an early photograph of Briggs. It's the only one we have of him as a young man. James Allen was the Minister of Defence in the Massey cabinet. It was his idea that these men who had failed their appeal board hearings, and I'll talk more about the appeal board hearings in a minute, should be still made to fight. So when there was a bit of room on this troop ship Waitemata, so 14 men, including Briggs, were frog-marched from 2 different jails and also the lock-up at Trentham military camp down to the gangplank and up into the bowels of the ship. So who was Mark Briggs? So let me go back to the beginning. He was born in Yorkshire in 1884, the son of a poor rural labourer. He had a younger brother. His mother died when he was young, and in 1904, the family made the decision to emigrate to New Zealand. All of them found work in the flax mills of Horowhenua and the Manawatu. Briggs, just go back to Briggs for a minute. Briggs found work and he wanted to work in the outlying flax mills. Now, the conditions in those outlying flax mills were very rugged. The men had half an hour for lunch, they had no hot water, they had flea-ridden bags, and they were expected to work for 12 and even up to 14 hours a day. Briggs became a spokesman for these men through the union. Later, the union abandoned the arbitration system and became a red-fed union, which meant that they only used striking as a means of recourse. Briggs went to Wellington to try to talk to the leaders, the managers, and got nowhere. And when he led a strike, he was blacklisted from all the mills in the Manawatu and Horowhenua, and in 1913 had to go north and work in the flax mills on the Hauraki Plains. In 1916, Bob Brown, who was one of his comrades in the flax mills in the Horowhenua, left and wanted to set up a excuse me for a minute, he wanted to set up a, I'm sorry, just lost that for a minute. He wanted to set up a auction house, in Palmerston North, in a sale room, and invited Briggs to go in with him. And Briggs did, early in 1916. However, later that year, in September of 1916, he was called up for military service. He had made it well known that he wouldn't serve. His objection to military service was a socialist one. The argument more or less stated that wars were the preserve of politicians and armament manufacturers, and the people who suffered were the working people at the front line of all armies. By this time, the government set up appeal boards, which had very narrow perspectives about who could be genuine conscientious objector. It just said that those churches like the Quakers and a few others who were very small fundamentalist churches who had tenets, pacifist tenets in their constitution, were allowed to be accepted as being genuine. Briggs said he just abandoned. He didn't go to the appeal board because he knew that they would give him a hard time and he wouldn't be accepted. He went then to the army jail at Trentham. He was court-martialed. He refused to drill. He refused to put on army uniform. In fact, this is the beginning of the kind of attitude that Briggs, he would have no part of any aspect of fighting the war whatsoever. He was an absolutist in that sense. All right. When he went to the ship, I should mention that this person, James Allen, he believed he was the Minister of Defence in the Cabinet, and he believed that they all should go to war, no matter what. Quite quickly, there were 13 others with him on the boat, and quite quickly Briggs exhibited a kind of moral leadership among these men for his adamancy. For example, when he got on there, all the 14 men were given army kits. He told them, don't wear them. Some did, some didn't, depended. They were taken down to the bowels of the ship. This is actually a photograph of actually on that ship, and there are two of these 14 men there, if I can just get my hand straight, one there and one there, who are actually being sized up to wear uniforms. That obviously wasn't Briggs or Baxter. 3 or 4 of them refused to wear civvies, the others did wear uniform. They wanted to give them all a haircut. The 13 of the men walked up to the deck of the ship and got a haircut. Briggs had to be dragged. So they dragged him up 3 or 4 flights of stairs. 6 men held him down and they gave him this very rough haircut. Red gouges appeared on his scalp at the end of that. I guess that just reflects where Briggs was going with this. They sailed to Cape Town in the Waitemata. There they changed ship. The name of the new ship was the Norman Castle. On that particular ship, the regulations were even tougher. In fact, the army authorities on the ship grabbed all the civilian uniforms of all the conscientious objectors, the 14 men, and threw them overboard. Most of them then put on a uniform. 4 of them, Briggs, Archie Baxter, Lawrence Kerwin and Henry Patton, refused to do so. So they spent the rest of their time in their undergarments, kept warm by blankets on the deck of the ship when they were there. When they got to Plymouth, which was preparatory to be taken to Sling Camp, which was the main camp where New Zealand soldiers went when they first went to Great Britain, they had to get on a cart back of a truck to be taken to the railway station, then to a carriage to at the end of the railway station, and another wee trip along to Sling Camp on the Salisbury Plain. Briggs wouldn't walk, he wouldn't talk to them. They dragged him, they threw him on a handcart, they threw him on the truck. At the railway station, they threw him in a carriage. At the end of the carriage, they took him off the carriage, put him on another truck for the trip to Sling. Okay, so he was dropped on the ground a number of times, deliberately by the military police. He just ignored that and went on through it. He never once responded with any kind of anger. He just took the punishment as it came to him. He continued to protest at Sling Camp. They saw that he was a kind of leader of the men, and he was incarcerated after a military court-martial in a separate clink away from the other objectors. He was kept in handcuffs, and for some of the time he was kept in leg irons as well, inside the cell. On the 14th of October, he began a hunger strike. 5 days later, the authorities at Sling kind of realised that they weren't going to get anywhere with Briggs. And he was the first one to be sent to France. He was sent to Étapes military camp in the south of France. That was the camp where soldiers, when they first went to France, went to. There he met this man, Colonel George Mitchell, who was in charge of Sling Camp. Now, Mitchell had already heard of Briggs. He'd already become a kind of minor called celeb, if you like. He said to Briggs, initially he said, I'm going to leave you in a hut over there. I'm not going to touch you. I want to get instructions from higher about what to do with you. Already he was causing them angst in terms of how do we deal with this man? How do we deal with this man? It didn't work. He refused. He was offered a job in the garden, but he refused to do that because that would mean the man in the garden would have to go to the front line. Again, he remained defiant. Refused to stand. He refused to even walk, actually, at Étapes camp, let alone stand or salute or wear uniform. He was dragged, carried, and thrown around in a handcart. And more than once, volunteer soldiers would take him around the back of the hut, military police mostly, and beat him up. Baxter would later write that he, Briggs and Lawrence Kerwin was the other one, was suffering from bruised and bloody faces was actually a standard procedure. So this happened periodically right through Briggs's time while he was in France. After a month, he was sent to another camp called Poperingi in Belgium, much closer to the front line. Again, this time he went up by train. He deliberately left the army kit that he was given on the train and of course, the rifle. Again, he refused to don a uniform at this camp. So, therefore, the Colonel Blair, who's in charge of this camp, sentenced him to 28 days field punishment. This is Bob Kerr, who I wrote this book with, of his painting of field punishment. As you can see, they were tied to a pole, tied around their ankles, around their knees, around their waists, and their hands were tied at the back of the pole. Under the regulations, the instructions were for these men to be strung up here for 3 or 4 hours a day for 28 days. Now, some of the men, and Baxter talks about it in his book, were up there for longer. It depended on which military policeman was organising the punishment. And some of these men had pretty sadistic attitudes towards these so-called shirkers. At the end of the 28 days, he did his full 28 days. You can see it was coming near to winter time and the weather was inclement. The rules stated, the army rules, that they were to be taken down if it started snowing or raining, but that may or may not have happened in all cases. He was up there with Henry Patton. I'll talk about it in a minute. He was one of the other 14. Now, then this man came to this camp. He was the commander-in-chief of all the New Zealand forces in France. He sought out Briggs. He was sought out and talked to him. He kind of secretly respected his stand. Quite remarkable. He told him and this is according to Briggs, who wrote about this story after the war, that if he was in Germany, he would be shot. He said, but we're not going to shoot you. I'm going to release and send you up to the stores at Cafe Bells for a month, which is another camp. No one will interfere with you there. At the end of the month, I will see you again to see if you've changed your mind. You know, Briggs, he said, you're fighting for freedom, and so am I. But I use different methods than you. Your methods may be right, or they may be wrong. Mine may be right, or mine might be wrong. I didn't hold the same ideas when I was your age that I hold today. Now, Briggs wasn't sure what was going on here. Was actually Russell buttering him up? So you're trying to get him to be more sympathetic to the idea of actually picking up a rifle, or not? He wasn't sure. But Russell did send him up the line. He worked in the army stores for 7 weeks in his civvies, and he received very fair treatment. However, we got another sergeant. Godley was the supreme commander of all New Zealand forces in France, and he had a very different attitude to Russell. He said that these men have got to be made to fight. So they shifted to another camp called the Belgian Chateau. Now they're just 1,500 metres behind the front line. Godley instructed that these men be taken up to the front line. And he said that there'd be a fair amount of brutality if they resist. And he was personally prepared for that to happen. Baxter, he was with Baxter and Lawrence Kirwan at this stage. Baxter and Kirwan agreed to walk. Briggs refused. So the MP sergeant told Briggs, or told all three of them, that it was his intention that he would break these men. He would make them fight, get to the front line where there was shelling going on at that particular time. This was with the Otago Battalion they were with at that time. At which point, when Briggs said he wasn't going to do it, again, he was struck and beaten and ordered 4 soldiers to drag him back to the hut. 3 days later, they brought them out. Again, Briggs refused to walk to the front line. I'm going to read what happened here from my book, and I quote, I just don't want to leave anything out. This is what happened when they did drag him to the front line. This time, at Briggs' continued defiance, the sergeant dragged him feet first on his back to the parade ground, where 3 soldiers were waiting. He found a long piece of cable wire and fastened around his chest and under his arms. The 4 men then harnessed themselves to the wire and began to drag Briggs along the duck walk the mile to the front line, with 2 soldiers hauling each leg. Battens had been nailed across the duck walk, and to make walking easier, wire netting had been nailed over them in parts. In consequence, the clothing that protected Briggs's back was torn off, leaving it exposed to the battens in the wire. His back, neck and arms soon became a massive lacerations, and blood oozed through the remains of his garments. Worst of all, a huge flesh wound was gouged into his right thigh and back, about 1 foot long, later described as being big enough to put your fist into. After half a mile, this strange group of men came to a large shell hole full of water. The redcaps asked Briggs if he'd like to walk. When he declined, the sergeant ordered that he be dragged through the shell hole. The pain running through his lacerations was unbearable, but Briggs put up with this without a murmur. On the bank of the second hole, the men took him by the shoulders and tipped him backwards into the water. Just as he managed to raise his head above the water to draw breath, the sergeant threw a handful of muck into his mouth, yelling, "Drown yourself, you bastard! You haven't got your Paddy Webbs or your Bob Semples to look after you now." Asked if he would walk, he muttered, "Never, as long as I can draw breath." Later, when they did walk back to the camp, he was unable to stand. The soldiers half carried, half towed him along, with his feet dragging uselessly behind. They never made the front line with Briggs, and this is Bob Kerr's image of that, where the duck walk finishes there, and they never got to the front. We're about 3/4 of the way there, and then they went back. We don't know exactly why they went back. The sergeant must have made that decision. When they got back to the camp, Briggs sought out one of the soldiers, the conscript soldiers that had dragged him, And he told Briggs that he'd been threatened with court-martial if he didn't obey the military policeman's order. Not only that, he said, if they make me do it again, I'm going to kill that sergeant. That's the kind of passion that was engendered with this process. It's remarkable. Right now, by this time he was bent double. They wouldn't fix up his lacerations for 2 or 3 nights. He lay bleeding in a hut. The big hole, there was blood coming out of the big hole in his thigh and on the lacerations of his back. Then he was shifted to another camp because they couldn't do anything there either with him. That was the story. If they couldn't do anything with him, they just passed him on to another camp. He was allowed to write home, and as all soldiers were, and he wrote this letter. There's no surviving letters that he wrote home to his father, but there's this one surviving letter that he wrote to Harry Holland, who was the editor of the Maryland Worker. And this appeared after they'd taken him back to ETARP's camp. After failing to take him to the front line, they transferred him back to ETARP's camp. And this is just not long after his experience on the duck walk. Just dropping you a line while I have the chance. I'm at ETARP's in France, still in Clink, just of the same mind as ever. I've had a very rough time of it, that's an understatement, but I've got through a lot live so far. I don't know what they intend to do with me, but I'm determined to see it through no matter what the circumstances. I have had some great experiences. What sort of euphemism is that? Anyway, down the bottom, remember me to your friends, tell them my message is just the same as ever. Workers of the world unite. And to my enemies, you can say that the spirit of Mark Briggs is still unbroken. That gives you some concept of the character of the man. Okay. Before I go into there, he was still unwell when he came back to ETARP's camp. But Mitchell, by this time, had decided that he should go through a medical board to be reassessed to see if he was fit to fight. And this was organised. And initially, this medical board said that he was suffering from a form of rheumatism, but he could stay on the base and do a patch job. Briggs said, there's no way I'm staying on the base and doing a base job, absolutely. So the defiance kept working. 4 days later, another appeal board with the same personnel assessed him again, and they classified him C2, unfit for military service because he had muscular rheumatism. Now that was just an out. He didn't have muscular rheumatism, but that was a get rid of an irritant around the camp who they couldn't do anything with. In that sense, Briggs had won his war. Before I just carry on to the rest of his life post-war, just tell you a little bit about the other 13 who went there briefly. So Fred Aden at the top left, Lawrence Penwright, Albert Sanderson. Those 3 did their time in solitary at Sling Camp, and at the end of the 23 days they did that, those 3 agreed to become stretcher bearers. John Baxter, Harland and Maguire, they protested again, like they all protested at Sling Camp. They were taken down to ETARP's camp. They refused to drill, they refused to put on uniform like all the others. They were taken away and given a court-martial 30 days, and at the end of that time they agreed to become stretcher bearers. In John Baxter's case, he was very sick, and it was very difficult for him to carry on receiving the treatment that he and the others got. 3 more, Sandy Baxter, Garth Ballantyne, and David Little. Now these 3 had a different experience altogether. They were taken away, and no one knows the actual reason, to another camp further north, to an English camp, where they were court-martialed and sentenced to 5 years solitary confinement. This was later commuted to 2 years. They served some of this time in a military prison near Dunkirk. So they were in this prison with murderers, soldiers who had killed their officers, rapists, and all sorts of other ne'er-do-well. So it wasn't a pleasant place to be. And the people that ran this prison were also a pretty bad lot. It's hard to imagine that these 3 genuine conscientious, were in this diabolical prison for refusing war on conscience grounds. It's remarkable that they was done this. There they were supposed to make batons for the duck walks. That was the job of the prisoners in this camp. They refused to do this because that was war work. So for much of the time they were handcuffed and leg ironed and thrown in these cells. And in this particular case, some of the time when the food came in, they weren't even allowed to take their handcuffs off. So they had to crawl along the floor and eat a bit of mouldy bread with their teeth. Unbelievable. The punishment at this particular camp was this thing called shot drill. What they had to do, and doesn't actually reflect what they had to do, they were required to lift 50-pound sandbags like this, hold them like this with their arms parallel to the ground, then walk forward 4 paces, squat down, put the sandbag on the ground, wait a couple of minutes, and then lift it up, at all times keeping your arms parallel with the ground, and walk forward another 4 paces until you can do it no longer. And sometimes they had a guard walking behind them with a cane, whacking them. So they did that as long as they could stand up. And when they couldn't do it anymore, they were dragged back to their huts and kept in their huts for whatever length of time. At the end of that horrendous treatment, those 3 men agreed to become stretcher bearers. Now, it's interesting that 17 days later, and they all lost weight, they all suffering diarrhoea. Little was particularly sick, but he was attached to the Wellington Battalion, and 17 days later, he was killed, saving a wounded man as a stretcher bearer. He was the only one to that happened to. At the end of the war, they all came back. Harry Holland, who was the leader of the Labour Party at that particular time, and an MP for Grey, replacing Paddy Webb, who was actually a conscientious objector and in one of the camps at the time. He was very concerned about these men. He had talked a lot about the ill treatment of conscientious objectors, and he particularly focused on the 14 men. He tried to see them all. 3 of them wrote stories for him, and he got a whole lot of letters from some of the men from the families, which he put in this book here, Armageddon and Calvary, which is a very important book. At the bottom it says, and this is just a comment that Holland says, and you can't read it, so I'll read it out. Mrs. Ballantyne asked for an assurance that the lads would not be subjected to persecution during the voyage to England. So James Allen replied that they would be not subjected to any persecution whatsoever. Briggs, after the war, he came back. He wasn't really majorly affected by his time. He seemed to survive that pretty well. He got back into his auctioneering business. He became active in the community. He played sport. He coached boxing. He stood on committees. One of his favourite activities, it seems a bit ironic, but he was a very keen pig hunter, and he had a series of dogs which you take out in pig hunting. This photograph was taken probably in the mid-1930s. I don't have any others. He met Bertha Burrell, the woman on the right, when he first came back to Palmerston North. She was a housekeeper in the private hotel that they stayed. They developed a romance and they got married in April of 1920. On the wedding night, she got the shock of her life because he never talked about any of his experiences in the war to anybody. And she saw the deep lacerations down his back and the huge hole near his thing. Briggs actually walked with a limp for the rest of his life because of that. They had one daughter, Joan, that's her there. When Bob and I were researching this book, Joan was still alive. She was 88, living in Taka, and we went down to talk to her. Sadly, she was very welcoming, and she was very keen to talk about her dad and what she knew about his experiences. But sadly, she was suffering from severe memory loss, so we didn't get much of information out of her, but it was nice to meet her. And their grandkids also were living in Taka, and we met them and talked to them as well. He was very keen Labor Party member. He did very well in his business, and he was able to build quite a substantial home in Palmerston North. And it became a home away from home from various Labor Party leaders when they came to Palmerston North to visit, people like Peter Fraser, Michael Savage, and others who came to stay in Palmerston North. He twice stood for Labor in the local body elections in Palmerston North. He didn't do very well. The second time he nearly got it. But more importantly, in 1935, when Labor came to power, he was approached by Michael Joseph Savage, and he asked Briggs if he would sit on New Zealand's Legislative Council, which was the upper house which we had then. Savage told Briggs he would serve as the conscience of the House, and his appointment would be as a symbol to all those opposed to war. Now, Briggs was humble. He didn't want to do this. He wasn't a natural politician. He just wanted to get on with life and live a normal life as possible. Twice he refused. The third time he agreed to become a member of the Legislative Council. He was fairly inactive in the council. He made a point of protesting when they put the regulations through to impose military conscription in the Second World War, but he was a man alone. He criticised, they set up a reviewing authorities later in the war. He criticised that they were too slow, and they didn't start operating until the war was nearly over. He lived until 1965. He died at the age of 80, quite reportedly despondent. The world seemed to be heading for another war, at that time starting in Vietnam. Now I want to expand the conversation and talk about the context with Briggs, and try and explain and come to a conclusion about why we were so tough on our wartime dissenters. The First World War was the first war where we had conscription. Previous wars, standing armies, volunteers, press gangs. First World War in Britain. Have a look at what they did for men who opposed the war. Well, in Great Britain, there were 16,000 men who didn't want to go and fight in that particular war and appealed as conscientious objectors. How are they going to be treated? How are they going to be assessed? How do they know they were genuine or not? Well, they didn't. They only could agree that, as I said earlier, a narrow band of religious fundamentalists who had pacifism stated in their constitution could be regarded as legitimate conscientious objectors. Of that 16,000, just 200 received absolute clearance. The bulk of those who lost their appeals either joined up as soldiers or as non-combatants, but 1,300 did not. And they went to jail for 2 years hard labour and then longer, another 2 years if they resisted again. In some cases, these men were court-martialled and some were even sentenced to death, although they were all commuted. However, 73 of those men stayed in prison for a long time and actually died in prison. Some were sentenced to mental asylums, where they saw the war out, and some actually became mentally ill while they were in these asylums, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives. In May of 1916, some of the camps, British camps, commanders, sent some of their men to the front line to try to make them fight, like they tried to make Briggs fight. This is before Briggs and the 30 men were sent over. None of those men fought. And it was done in secret, and when word got out, there was a bit of an embarrassment to the government. They were all sent back to England. This happened before Briggs and company, and James Allen and the Massey government would have known this, but they still persisted with that policy. Okay. In New Zealand, how did we deal with it? We were neo-colonial. We just borrowed the British regulations and imposed them here. The same appeal board system, the same very narrow criteria for exemption. That was it. Of the 637 men in New Zealand who applied for conscientious objection status, just 73 or 9% of the total had been assessed as being genuine. As in Great Britain, most of them then had a choice of whether they'd carry on resisting and be sent to jail, or join the army as combatants or non-combatants. There was a corollary to this. We had imposed military conscription in the middle of 1916, and there were a group of socialist agitators, you could call them, who spoke out publicly against the imposition of military conscription. One of them was Peter Fraser. In fact, this is his photograph, his prison photograph that they took early in 1917 before he did a year's jail for sedition. In Great Britain, there was an outpouring of anger after the First World War. Of how COs had been treated. Britain had a long-standing and much treasured libertarian tradition on issues of conscience, which effectively had gone back to the days of the Reformation of the 16th century. So now in the 20s and 30s, politicians of independent spirit, prominent theologians, including 2 archbishops of Canterbury, some academics, some wealthy gentry, all coalesced and argued that such brutality would never happen again. It's amazing how many pacifists were in Britain in the 20s and 30s. The biggest group there was an organisation called the Peace Pledge Union. In 1935, it had 400,000 members. At the outbreak of war in 1939, it still had 130,000 members. There was still passive activity going on, even when the Blitz was happening. So there was no way that intolerance was going to happen again. This man, Chamberlain, when he was Prime Minister in 1930, he said in the House of Commons that there would be no persecution of people who had deep-seated opposition to militarism. Who lost? This man. Remarkably, this is what Churchill said. He had heard and became annoyed when he learned that some employers had dismissed objectors from their workforce. He said in Parliament, anything in the nature of their persecution, victimisation, is odious to the British people. Remarkable comment. And so the appeal boards they established in the Second World War in Great Britain to assess the validity of objection were very different than the First World War. For a start, they set up an appeal board which just judged conscientious objection, whereas in the First World War they judged other things as well. And they had some training. There was even women on this thing, which never happened before. And they gave these people some psychological training so they'd get some insight in what could be seen as being conscientious objection. A big central board of conscientious objectors was formed with a tacit approval of the government. It acted like a watchdog on the appeal board process. So what happened in the appeal boards in the Second World War in Great Britain? 30,000 objectors on conscientious objector grounds. Of that, 53%, around 16,500, were assessed as being genuine and released unconditionally. 16,500. Those who were not were given a second chance because the government had set up an appellate tribunal so they could take their case there. And what happened there was that 54% of them were given genuine status. Those that failed were sent to prison for 6 months, and then they were released on a kind of parole system to go out and work where there were huge labour shortages. For example, on farms, in quarries, driving trucks, on fishing boats, in the forestry, because they were replacing the labour of the men who had gone away to fight. It was a win-win situation. The great bulk of them were happy to help Britain in a non-military way during a time of stress. There was a few that stayed in jail and wouldn't do that, and they stayed in jail for the rest of the war. Okay. It's not only in Britain this happened. This is Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister of Australia. And he said this in a similar debate in his House Parliament. He said, "We must remember that the greatest tragedy that could overcome a country would be for it to fight a successful war in defence of liberty and to lose its own in the process." So we were fighting fascism overseas. We were denying in New Zealand the men the right to protest. There was no civil liberties. There was in Australia. In the Australian, they had an appeal board system, as they did in America, as they did in Canada. And in a general sense, they did the same kind of. These men that had failed their appeal boards went out and helped in mostly labouring jobs in the economy. The only restriction was they couldn't get paid. They had to sign in a parole, and they couldn't get paid more than a private in the army. So, what happened here? Same man, Peter Fraser, 1939. After the war broke out, soon after the war broke out, this man was in charge. So as he was concerned, this was a very different war, and he was embarrassed to be reminded of his anti-conscriptionist past. And he was not going to, made it quite clear, he was not going to be soft on dissenters in this very different war, which was a different war. There was huge pressure on him. There was a powerful right-wing defence league, business and farmers groups, newspaper editors, the National Party opposition, especially after Sid Holland became its leader, and even more so, the New Zealand RSA, which was a very powerful body. They said they didn't want any kind, they might put pressure on Fraser and his government that they weren't going to be accepting of any kind of liberality towards people who opposed fighting in this war. And Fraser had their ear. So, firstly, a successive emergency regulation saw passives banned from speaking publicly in dissent, fined and went in prison. That was also unique to New Zealand. The appeal boards that were established in New Zealand, did they look to Britain for an example? No, they went back to the same restrictions of the First World War and just brought it forward to here. So the appeal board system was virtually identical to World War I. The same narrow group of criteria applied. So these, I'll give you some statistics. By June of 1945, 3,000 men had appealed as conscientious objectors. 12% were allowed. Compare that with the 53% in Great Britain and the 54% with the appellate tribunal. 40% were dismissed subject to non-combatant service. 40% were dismissed outright. So there were 1,200 men. Of those 1,200 men, approximately 400 agreed to join the army. 800 refused to. And they were military defaulters. They were assessed as being military defaulters, conscientious objectors. Now, what are we going to do to these men? Are we going to send them out and help the farmers or the people in the forestry or the people on the ships or the people doing that like they did in Great Britain? No. These people were accorded very little liberality and they were really seen as being prisoners. So what they did, they built prison camps. They built prison camps. The one thing that did change in the First World War, they did not send them to the army. Briggs and Company made sure that they were going to be an irritant in the army. So they sent prison camps. And secondly, these men were sentenced to these prison camps for the duration of the war. Now, in 1941, you didn't know how long the war was going to last. It was even tougher than the First World War because they didn't start then until 1917. So these men who went to these prison camps could have been there for 3, 4, 5 years. This is one of the prison camps. Kevin's father was probably in this camp. That's Hautukan, that's one of the biggest ones. So there were 4 big camps built. Hautu, that was near Turangi, Strathmore, which was between Taupo and Rotorua, and 2 on the flats, ironically up here, Whitinui and Paiaka. Work in the camps, some men had indoor work in the camp, but the others, and most of them, were told that they were going to make farms for the returned soldiers on the pumice land out in then. So they went out with basic implements like shovels and slashes, so cutting the gorse, cutting the ragwort in the thistle and company. But they didn't, that was it. They weren't doing that really, because they went out the following season and that stuff had grown up again. That land, the pumice land, particularly needed a whole lot more than just CO's been going out there. They were controlled by whistles. They had guards, they called the inmates, called them inmates, called them screws. It was a prison camp. Unbelievable. Only happened in New Zealand, unique to New Zealand. Okay. At Whitinui and Paiaka, their main job there was to weed the flax. Flax didn't need to be weeded. You don't need to weed the flax. They spent seasons down there weeding the flax. So, what was happening here, they were just out of sight, out of mind. They didn't want them. They just ignored them. We tried to ignore them. These camps were a long way from any built-up area. So that was what was going on. It was useless. Okay, if you protested, and it took very little to be considered a protest, you could have a meeting without permission of the superintendent of the camp, and that would be a penalty. In June of 1942, the government put through an order in council, there was no discussion about that from now on those that protested in camp would be sent straight to prison and do their indeterminate prison sentence in prison. And they were. There was more than 100 of them from those camps sent to prisons all around the country. Lots of them went to Mount Eden because there was room there. The RSA, particularly always in Fraser's ear, they demanded that they wanted none of these shirkers to be released until all the soldiers had come home from overseas. That actually didn't work. My own father came home from war near Christmas in 1945 after doing some peacekeeping in Trieste in Italy. And most of the COs had been released from there, but there was still some of the non-cooperators who continued to non-cooperate in prison. The last CO was released in June of 1946. That's fully 13 months after the war with Germany had finished. So why were we so tough? Why did we not change our mind in the Second World War as the other Allied countries had done? A lot is Fraser's personality. He encapsulated the need for us to be compliant in our attitude towards fighting this particular war. We were a young, immature country, and I'm talking about the bulk of New Zealand population who would have agreed with Fraser and the attitude towards these men, probably. Duty, discipline, equality of sacrifice, which is the main argument for conscription, and patriotism. Fraser was self-assured and had the support of his government, had support of everyone else around him. He needed that to make his mark as an international statesman, and you could argue that he did. He was one of the leaders of the setting up of the United Nations at San Francisco after the war, and he has to be credited with that. But there was no argument for any kind of contrary voice or contrary action while he was Prime Minister. And remember Michael Joseph Savage's famous comment soon after war broke out, "Where Britain goes, we go. Where Britain stands, we stand." I can tell you right now that on the thorny issue of conscience objection and all issues of tolerance for the non-conformist conscience, nothing could have been further from the truth between us and Great Britain. Thank you.